Horror is probably my second favorite video game genre to play, nestled somewhere between story-driven fantasy games and turn-your-brain-off mascot platformers. When I got into gaming for the PC back in 2010, my best friend showed me 3 games to get me interested: Half-Life 2, League of Legends, and Dead Space. I was immediately hooked. Gaming for me, up until that point, was a super nerdy hobby that felt kind of childish. The most mature games I played to that point were like Final Fantasy X and Metal Gear Solid 4. PC gaming brought me into the wide world of the internet and everything that entails. Gaming felt a bit more grown up after having been exposed to aliens that morphed people's bodies to better kill other humans, or hordes of zombies chasing you down across rooftops, or navigating a derelict prison ward as you try to rescue a rebellion leader. As such, I like to think that I've developed a bit of a standard as to what I want out of horror games, and I've been through enough of them to realize what works and what doesn't. Granted, that's entirely a personal list of do's and don'ts, but there's a reason most of these titles are successful while many of others never took off. So today I've gathered a list of things I'd like to see out of my ideal horror game. I don't think I'd ever be competent enough to go out and make any kind of video game myself. Believe me, I've tried. So I plan to just lay out my thoughts for all to enjoy and critique, and maybe someone more talented than me will get inspired by my thought process as we share our ideas. This video will borrow footage from other video games to help make my points, as well as showcase the inspirations from the games I've played since the beginning to better help put you, the viewer, in my mindset as I explain them. There's potential for me to spoil a couple of these as well, so in case you haven't played them already or something like that, I'll put a content warning out for Dead Space, Outlast, Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Amnesia, and Five Nights at Freddy's, cause that's all you're gonna get. In this video, I'll be going over the basic premise, the setting, characters, a story outline, and gameplay mechanics I'd like to implement within this theoretical game. So without any further delays, here's the pitch for my perfect horror video game. The premise of the game is following the story of the player getting roped into the clutches of a man driven by an obsessive purpose executed with questionable ethics. The main character, completely by coincidence, stumbles across a complicated experiment being performed by a scientist slowly losing his mind to an incurable disease. The main character will get dropped into the middle of several incidents throughout the game where some sick everyday person is being manipulated by the scientist as he researches a cure for his and other people's diseases. However, as he's losing his own mind and the people within the game are just as deranged after being experimented on for so long, it turns into a hellish endeavor and surviving the encounters aren't exactly guaranteed. This game should feel like you've walked into a complicated event happening around you where the variables are already in motion and you being there is completely unaccounted for. Things happen around you that you have no control over, but you will be affected by instantly and dramatically. It's up to the player to figure out what's going on and either escape with your life or put an end to the insane machinations of a man losing his mind. This game will take place in the enormous estate of a very rich, very reputable biological scientist. His property is large and contains a mansion, a hedge maze garden, and a smaller guest house. The main building is separated into 3 floors, each with their own amenities. Several bedrooms and bathrooms, a library, a recreation wing, a dining hall, and of course multiple basements. A couple of laboratories can even be found across the property, some larger than others, though the scientist's main lab is hidden from view. Each floor is divided into wings and are inhabited by the scientist's victims, and territory is traded frequently like some kind of gang war. By the time the player gets there to visit, the place is completely torn apart, with walls and furniture damaged, doors having their locks changed, and some just missing outright. Some rooms have been repurposed by the crazed victims as well, and some of those have created layers out of their residential areas. The player will have to navigate mazes, locked areas of interest, and dodging the experimental victims as they proceed through the game. Sometimes they'll be searching for keys, sometimes solving puzzles to get to the next wing of the mansion. Sometimes they'll just be plain attacked and need to deal with them somehow. Speaking of which, I probably ought to go over how this game will function now, as it'll get difficult to discuss much else without describing how I want the player to interact with everything. Basically, I want to find a happy medium between Outlast's based gameplay of running, sneaking, and hiding, while also implementing basic combat techniques as seen in something like Bendy and the Ink Machine. I'll go over the main character's attributes in a few minutes, but when the player is playing the game, I don't want them to feel completely helpless. I don't think it's entirely realistic to expect every person who finds themselves in a situation like this to just do nothing, aside from flee from encounters. But I also don't want a survival horror game protagonist to enter every situation like freaking Rambo and just mow down anyone that gets in their way with a big enough gun. So being able to balance a gameplay style that promotes using stealth and sneaking to get through the areas that require it, while also allowing them to use a flashlight or a light melee weapon to push enemies away would also be fun and provide challenge where needed. No guns or rifles or anything like that, but maybe ranged combat could boil down to something like using a slingshot or a throwable item. Melee combat would be reduced to getting in some stealth takedowns and parrying attacks with a knife or a club or something like that. Just an idea to give the player a fighting chance when the stealth mechanics don't work in their favor. And for the non-combat mechanics, I would implement something like Resident Evil style puzzle solving to help progress the story. The building has been taken over by people losing their minds, so of course they're going to scatter keys and make man-made blockades that stop the player from easily accessing certain parts of the building. So learning where the item that progresses the game is hidden, marking it on a map, and going to that area only to encounter a guy or need to solve a puzzle or a fetch quest or something to get the item you need would be how I imagine the minute-to-minute gameplay would go. For example, let's say the player is on the second floor and needs a key to get into a room that belongs to a patient named, I don't know, Dolores or something. Dolores has gone crazy and doesn't live in the room anymore, but the key she used to get in it was put on her car keys. So in order to get into that room, you'd need to venture through the mansion down to the parking garage to find Dolores's car keys hanging up. But when you get to the garage, another patient victim is roaming the area, so you'll need to avoid him as you peruse the garage. If you do get spotted, you have a tool or a small weapon of some kind to stave him off, but he's got like a giant wrench or something to dissuade you from direct confrontation. Essentially, I want to give empowerment to the survival horror games where players don't have any way to interact with the enemies they encounter, but also don't want to go crazy with giving them the ability to destroy their way through the game. Even games that rely on like a pistol are a bit too much for me, but I do think that it could be fun to really let players loose in the final chapter or something. So maybe after playing an entire game where the player is on the back foot, never defenseless but never in power, the game could deliver a nice weapon to really let the player give their fears and anxieties away by mowing down the people who've been hunting them the entire time. I don't know, could be worth thinking about. But the core experience of this game should be stealth driven, solving puzzles that ramp up in complexity, and the hanging fear of things getting worse for the player over the entirety of the campaign. As you unlock more of the mansion to traverse and investigate, you never really release the tension, as you're just opening the way forward into more of the chaos and unearthing the vicious nature of the experiments taking place here. I think now's as good a time as any to talk a bit about the people involved in this game, since they'd be an obvious highlight for the game going into it. There's a lot more bad guys than good guys in this story, since we'd be dealing with psychopaths and mentally disturbed people. We'll start with the protagonist, a person I'm gonna call Kurt Anderson. Kurt is a 26-year-old man living in a small rural town in the southern United States, who's recently just graduated police academy and has been on the job for about 2 weeks in his hometown. Kurt is a pretty careful guy who never took any shortcuts in life, but didn't end up with any career or hobby that interested him enough to pursue after school. Kurt is a bright thinker and capable of solving problems efficiently, and has already made some waves in the local police precinct. The owner of the mansion we'd be exploring in this game is named Dr. Sylvester Grant, a 62-year-old neurologist who studied his whole life in protecting and healing the brain. Recently, his wife has come down with an advanced advanced form of Alzheimer's, and has had to take a break from his regular duties to help take care of her. Though, being a scientist in the field of brain research, he couldn't just leave it alone. He set up multiple experiments within his own home, looking for a cure for his wife's disease. Dr. Grant has also invited other people with neurological diseases and disorders to his own home for study, letting them live on the premises for as long as they work with him. Mrs. Sophia Grant is Sylvester's wife. They've been together for over 35 years, and she's always supported her husband in his career. She's a soft woman capable of empathizing with anybody and is a very good homebody. While they've never had children, Sophia has taken care of her family's kids before, and even some from their little quiet neighborhood, and has developed a rapport with the locals of their town. When it was announced that she had fallen ill, there was many people from all over who tried to help, but Sylvester shut them all out immediately, feeling that he was the only one who could effectively take care of his sick wife. Throughout the game, Kurt will encounter deranged patients under Dr. Grant's care that have undergone mental breaks and mutations that change their behavior. These people will have turf and specialties that make them unique to fight and frightening in their own battles. These people include Veronica, a young woman with short-term memory loss who forgets whether or not her parents died in a traumatic car crash. Kevin, a man who suffered a stroke after being struck by a truck while riding his bicycle, losing control of the right side of his body. Carly, a middle-aged woman who woke up from a 4-year coma after being attacked by her husband, and Dr. Alan Woodberg, a dentist from the city who developed Parkinson's disease and is a personal friend to Dr. Grant. These are the main characters I've come up with so far. As you could probably tell, the characters in this game would grow more significant as time proceeds in the game. Each of them have something fundamentally wrong with them, and they all take root in a neurological disorder of some kind to relate them to the main villain. Dr. Grant, being an intelligent and desperate person taking advantage of other sick people, makes for a decent plot device that can convey the themes and goals of the story well, and even allow for the audience to potentially sympathize with him by the end. Our protagonist, being an intelligent type as well, not necessarily book smart, but more like a strong sense of morality, would clash ideologically with the main villain and provide interesting conversation and perspective. And on top of all of that, getting to see the sad and sorry state of each of the victims provides a way for the player to be invested in what exactly the good doctor was trying to accomplish as well. One of my favorite things about successful story and gameplay conveyance in video games is when the player is able to put together the pieces themselves and also justify the villain and hero's actions at the same time. In the end, it all comes down to personal preference, and I would love to create that kind of framework with a story like this. And while I don't have every single detail ironed out about the story for this theoretical video game, I do have a basic premise which I can iterate on now that the pieces have all been laid out before you. To start at the beginning, the origin of the story starts when Dr. Grant's wife finally succumbs to the advanced stages of her Alzheimer's. Dr. Grant can no longer work full-time at the hospital in the city and thus has to distribute care from his home. So he retires and contacts several of his patients with the goal of having them move into his home in the countryside to continue his treatment for them, as well as perform additional research that he couldn't get away with at the hospital. Slowly, his research becomes less and less ethical, taking shortcuts and performing experiments that would likely get him arrested and jailed. However, since his victims all have little or no family and are all living within his residence, he gets away with it rather smoothly. That is, until one night. During a particularly stormy night, the newly hired officer Kurt and his partner receive a call about a major disturbance coming from a residence on the outskirts of town, so they drive out to help. The drive there is horrible, as intense rain and wind makes it difficult to see so late at the end of the evening. They end up in a crash involving a semi-truck and fly off a bridge over a river nearby to their destination. When Kurt wakes up after the wreck, he discovers his partner isn't by the vehicle at all, and the cliff is too steep to climb back up. Heading upriver for a little while leads him to a landing that leads up the bank and towards a massive property, which he recognizes as the countryside residence of Dr. Sylvester Grant, the retired neurologist looking after his sick wife. In an attempt to find help and search for his missing partner, Kurt enters the property and quickly finds himself locked in and trapped, pursued by one of the residents here. After finally entering the building itself through the attic window, he finds his partner horribly mutilated and on the verge of death, telling him to flee and get as many people as he can to come in for backup. From there, the game starts properly, with Kurt taking the responsibility of finding out who's doing this, for what reason, and bring them to justice, all while escaping with his life. At the end of the game, Kurt will discover the true motivations of Dr. Grant, that he was using his former patients as test subjects to unlock the secrets of the brain in order to save his sick wife. However, the Alzheimer's in Sophia is already at an advanced stage, so he couldn't do much to cure her with the amount of time he had left. So he decided to test his research on as many people as possible, even using some methods on himself to try and unlock parts of his brain that might help him grow more intelligent. All this did was further his own insanity, robbing him of his morality and sense of duty. Eventually it became fun for him and less about saving his wife. When Kurt ends up encountering him at the end of the game, he has the choice of either killing Dr. Grant as retribution for the people he wronged and disgracing his wife's memory, or arresting him and bringing him to justice, letting him suffer in his own madness for every second he has left in his life. The game will end on one of two ways depending on what the player chooses here, and potential sequels would just ignore this ending and take place in an entirely different location with different characters and settings to make up for it. And that's it. That's my ideal horror game. A large, semi-open-ended exploration game that involves very real but very exaggerated depictions of illness that can and do affect real people in real life. I think this would be a real dead ringer if I could get it brought to life. What I like most about this idea is that it's the kind of story you could believe if you heard it in real life. Resident Evil 7 almost hits this kind of beat too, but the roots of that game deal with giant biological weapons of mass destruction, psychic mold children, and the dead coming back to life. And like, Outlast is great and all, but I can't believe that a corporation alone could keep a massive asylum hidden from the general public. Nanomachines? Really? Anyway, this is just my interpretation of what I believe was the best things about each of those games and the elements I would take advantage of if I were to build my own game from the ground up. Of course, that's likely never gonna happen, but hey, if a game comes out that basically does what I just listed out for y'all, well, you heard it here first. Let me know what you thought about my thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and share with your friends who like talking about spooky stuff. That's gonna do it for me today, everybody, so thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to stay awesome, be kind, and rewind. My name's Meganimanic, and this has been my pitch for my ideal horror game. Excelsior!